Everyone, Mr. Fishman has the coolest video. You ought to see the new video. Mr. Fishman put out this amazing video with his music and his hiking. Hi, Ruth. That video you put out was amazing. I really enjoyed that trailer. Well done with that, sir. You doing all right?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm doing great. I made it to New Mexico. I'm here. It's happening.
Well done, sir. I like the ceiling. That is very pretty behind
Isn't
you,
that
my good
cool?
man.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, beautiful little room here. Give you a
Oh,
little
look
tour,
at that.
right?
Well done, Hyrule. And everyone, Hyrule is also like a like a master woodwork craftsman. He's like a freaking amazing at the craftsmanship of his woodwork. So well done, Mr. And Mr. Flores, good to see you, sir. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. And Javier over here has been putting out the videos. I tell you what, that guy's been all over it. Javier, I liked your recent one on worry and the difference between getting advice between from like coworkers where you're like, yeah, whatever, who cares? But then worry from loved ones and how that's an entirely different matter when like loved ones are like, oh, you're not going to be able to get a job because of your religious studies major versus like advice from a coworker. I thought that was really, really good. Michelle and I think a lot about that topic on like how worry changes things. Because if your parent is like, hey, you shouldn't get you shouldn't be studying philosophy because you'll never get a job. Well, then if you study philosophy, that's immediately going to infringe upon your relationship with your parent. And they may be upset with you and it may like, really get in the way of interacting with them. And how to navigate that is a particularly difficult subject. So I really appreciated that video that you put out, Javier.
Can I just come in here?
Of course you can.
Because well, I never finished high school and stuff. And like I kind of used like I started reading philosophy because I felt like I needed something that could make sense, of, of of life and everything. And I always felt guilty for reading it. Like I still do. I still have this thing of like, okay, I gotta like study like proper things like my software engineering school and things like that. So it's yeah, it's very interesting, and I think philosophy is there's this weird kind of activity, right? Freud talks about that the neurotic, because he cannot bear reality, he flees into his neurotic rituals or his little symptoms that he does. Now, you can also understand art to be this, right? Like the artist cannot bear reality as it is, like mundane reality. So he flees into his art, into his creation, or into the consumption of art even. And there he can create his own world. Like Nietzsche says, the worldless one creates his own world. And in philosophy, we're also kind of doing this. And it's always done to me that it's interesting that, in going away from this mundane, unbearable reality, we flee ourselves, right? We flee this negativity. But philosophy seems like, if it's genuine philosophy, it seems to be this kind of movement where, in fleeing ourselves from unbearable reality, we actually stumble upon ourselves in like philosophizing. I think this is, you can see with happening in psychoanalysis and Hegel, and of course a lot of other philosophy is similar like that.
No, that's a beautiful comment. I'll pass it to Michelle. It makes me think of Javier's other video on where Hegel in the prologue is like, look up. There's kind of this idea that if you read this book and it's not striking you, then you always have to remember that the subject of philosophy is life. Like, it's not very Hegelian to be a Hegelian in a funny way, right? Like, if you're like, oh, I'm going to be a Hegelian scholar, you're not really doing what Hegel's telling you to do, right? Because the subject of a true philosopher is life. Therefore, you should be studying life more than the philosopher. The issue is that philosophers, if they're good philosophers, have spent a whole lot of time, generally speaking, kind of in the craft and art of trying to understand life. So they might be able to give you unique tools and methods and skills that for you to arrive at on your own may take like 30 years of work. Whereas, you could, without it's like in trade school, right? I mean, you could learn how to be a blacksmith without a master blacksmith. It just may take a whole lot longer. And you may make a lot of mistakes you didn't have to make if you would have just gone under that toolerage. And a similar thing can go with philosophers. Dimitri, you're great. Is where going under their toolerage may help you avoid, say, problematic conflations of love and fear or concern, right? where without them, you may have never gained that skill, or it may have taken you a lot longer. But it is really important, I think, to always keep in mind, and then I'll give it to Michelle, that like when Hegel in the prologue's like, look up, just like you were bringing attention to, Javier, it's like, yeah, don't ever forget that the point of this is life, which then makes me think of Mr. Fishman's wonderful video of going through the mountains. And exactly right, like it has to come back to life. Or one of the advantages of psychoanalysis is coming back to the subject, right? Now, the reason why it seems like philosophy can be important is because actually understanding the concrete is a lot more difficult than it seems, right? Like it's actually more difficult to understand the concrete than it seems, because it turns out that it is not self-evident how you should respond to your parents when they give you advice to not waste your life according to their standards, right? If it was self-evident how you should respond to them, then you would not need to say, read these books or think about these subjects, right? The issue is that it is not self-evident. And also at the end of the day, it has a lot to do with risk management. What risks should you take? What risks shouldn't you take? What is worth taking and what is not? Well, that all requires some sort of mechanisms of thinking through. And so these things become valuable. But let me give it to Michelle here. Hi, Haven. How are you doing?
Just eating just eating the best shrimp in the world. Nashville hot shrimp. That was my best advertisement.
Best advertisement, absolutely. Nashville hot shrimp. So yeah, I wanted to quickly speak to the video that you did, Javier, which was so good about like the grind culture and this idea of worry. And I think what makes it particularly likely that, you know, the people who like we're going to care about most, like their opinion, like the people whose opinion we care about most are those who are in our lives for long, ever, really. Like, I mean, you'll always be family, right? And I think there's this way in which what's particularly challenging with the parental role is that, in a sense, it was their job to take care of you as a child, right? Like, it is their job to make sure you're fed and cared for and all of this. And so it's particularly hard to pass that baton, right? Like for much of our childhood, you listen to for most part, you listen to what your parents say and like they take care of you, and that's the dynamic. So it's very difficult that passing the baton to the child as they mature into their own adulthood is such a radical letting go, because for very many years, it's like I think about it from a motherly perspective, like you're literally holding the child in utero, like you don't let go, you're holding so that they grow. Then they're born, then you hold them a lot, like just physically. And then, and so it's a process of over time, letting them go, they learn to walk, and all of these things of their growing independence. And so I think that's why it makes it particularly challenging. So I think that's why, like, it's just really a note on that. Like, why does that happen? Why is that so challenging? Well, because it's like this radical reversal or this radical shift from everything that you are programmed and almost biologically wired to do, and then you have to let go. So it's a even more, I think, radical letting go, but it's still necessary, right? Like you still got to let the little birdies fly out of the nest. So, anyway, so yeah, I just wanted to say that real quick.
Well, thank you, Michelle. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I think this is probably one of the most difficult things about philosophy in general, because you start reading philosophy and you get really excited and you want to tell your friends, and then you find out your friends don't care. Right? And then you're like, okay, cool, this might put a hindrance on our relationship. Right? Because you're like, you don't understand something that is kind of like very important here. So a lot of this is kind of like navigating this kind of human relationship. And obviously, even if somebody does worry about you, you may not worry about the thing that they're raising, but then you start worrying about the relationship that is at risk here. And that is the part that is like kind of hard to escape. You really start worrying about the relationship. You're like, look, I disagree, but like, I don't want this to damage our relationship. And what is difficult about that is you may be fine with it being maintained. You have no control over the fact that they may not be okay with it. They may completely disown you, disabandon the relationship. So this is the risk that we take when we decide to do this. So yeah, I've been thinking about how worry is such a visceral force, because even if you tell yourself like, I'm not going to worry about this, I don't care, the thing is, you do care. Like, it's really hard to not care when it's somebody that you've talked to for so long and you like. And, you know, even in conversations in the net, you do, sometimes you feel a visceral reaction to disagreeing because you don't want to disagree. You know, you genuinely like the person, but sometimes there are points of disagreement. So thinking through this issue, it's been extremely hard to solve, because ultimately when we're talking philosophy already, this is a kind of philosophy that I'm trying to either portray or describe. Like, there's a philosophy that's already being enacted by by the very fact of speaking, thinking about thinkers, talking. Something is being enacted here, and you know, I've been thinking about this issue a lot. So yeah.
Anyway, the point that you're getting at, Javier, is really good. It makes me think also, kind of like you'll see in religion, where if someone's like, oh, I believe in Jesus, that can actually become a hindrance to relationships, because then they feel a pressure to tell everyone about Jesus. And if they don't convert, they're going to hell. And that like destroys the relationship. But then so it's like, and also knowing that person's a Christian and that they might bring up Jesus in the conversation in a manner that forces you to convert ruins everything, because you're like, well, and it's not that you ever necessarily come out and say, I don't want to be around you because you're a Christian. You just kind of pull away silently and stop interacting with them, right? Now, of course, we're talking the hardcore, like evangelical, like it's like when they knock on your door and they're going to tell you something from a different religion. You're like, if you were literally visiting, it would be okay. But if it's with a certain agenda, then it doesn't feel good, right? Well, a similar thing can happen. In a way, philosophy is a similar dynamic. It's just that less people do philosophy, so the problem of the dynamic is more pronounced. Whereas, say, if you're Christian and you live around a lot of other Christians, for example, well, then this problematic dynamic, or Muslim or whatever, won't come out as much. But when it comes to like philosophy, because philosophy tends to be rarer, at least in the way that we're talking here, that's when it can come out more, right? I think, and so this notion of being worried about, I think worry is so fascinating, because if I'm worried that you're going to waste your life, Javier, which I'm not worried, honest. Anyway, if I'm worried that you're going to waste your life, there's literally nothing you can do to convince me you won't. Like, that's a true self-relating negativity right there. Like, when we use that phrase self-relating negativity, that's an internally consistent system that whatever you say, I can make fit into my view of you that negates it. Like, I can always find evidence that I'm right. It's very similar to the problem of trust. Like, if I say, Javier, you have to earn my trust, I decide when you earn it. I could theoretically always move the bar, right? And so that, and here's the thing, if trust is the necessary precondition for relationship, almost to the point, Michelle has a great paper on this, to the point basically where trust is relationship. Like, if you think about it, trust basically is relationship. like it's hard to even, like, trust is not really something you add to relationship. It is the enactment of relationship, right? So if I say, oh, Javier, you have to earn my trust, well, there has to be a relationship to earn the trust, which ergo the trust is given. So it cancels itself out. So trust is either given or withdrawn. It's not really earned. It's just given or withdrawn, right? Likewise comes with worry. Like, you can't stop worry. It's kind of the reverse of that problem. Like, I either worry or just stop. Like, it's either on or off. There's no point where I can, like, objective point where I turn it off, right? And yeah, people say, well, wait a minute, no, once you once you stop following religious majors, then I stopped worrying, so you can turn it off. You see how that, but what you did there actually is remove the subject of the worry. That's not the same as giving them reason not to worry. What you did is remove the worry remove the world where worry challenged them. And that's always what happens. You brought that up in your video, right? Like, when somebody worries, you either fold or you say no, and now there's a strain there, right? Like, we really have to understand that both trust and worry are examples of things that are either on or withdrawn. They can't be worked through, in a sense, right? Like, you can't earn a person's trust. Likewise, you can't, with worry, get to the point where you give them reason not to worry other than to stop doing the thing. But that's not the same. You're just removing the condition of the worry. And so this is where then, but you see, this is actually an example where, say, philosophy is useful, because everything I just said is a meta-analysis that would require philosophy to realize, right? And I think here is what philosophy is supposed to do. Like, this is the role of philosophy, not becoming a Hegelian or a Humean or a Heideggerian, but the meta ability to see, oh, look how worry structures situations that you can never escape it. that if you didn't ever get outside of it to look at it, you would just be in it. So you'd be swirled around in the whirlpool and you wouldn't get out of it, right? Likewise, if you never looked at how trust worked, you would ever go, wait a minute, trust isn't really something you earn. It's just something you give or you don't. Now, again, if someone steals from you, you remove the trust. We're not saying you just trust everyone, but it's a different dynamic that's at play. And you see, but if you never have the meta-analysis to see that, well, then you just kind of get swept around, right? And I think also, and then I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak, basically what happens where disagreement with philosophers becomes like they never talk to each other again is where basically the issue is that my reading of Hegel is my baby. And if you question it, I lose my identity. Well, hey, that's not supposed to be that's not what you're supposed to do. Philosophy is supposed to be about life. And if you actually make me realize that like Hegel's in the way of me seeing life, then that's a good thing, right? Now, the problem is it becomes very difficult not to get invested in any kind of work to where when somebody questions it, it's very difficult not to then feel that on a visceral emotional level. And also, a lot of people like to critique without doing the work of critique. Like I hear a lot of people online saying, oh, it's good to have critique. It's good to oppose. Yeah, but there's also a game theory dynamic where it's way easier to be the critic than do the work. And sometimes we can incentivize being a critic because then we have all the power because we see how your reading of Hegel is wrong when we ourselves haven't done any work. And that's a problematic dynamic. And I think a emphasis on the doing the work is important because it's so much in human nature just to be a critic. However, when it comes to costly critique, like a critique you've earned because you've worked and you've thought about it, that's utterly invaluable for the advancement of thought in the gaining of wisdom, right? So that's really important. And arguably, Javier, what you're describing is what destroyed the university system. The dynamic you're describing is what has kind of destroyed the university system. I think it is utterly critical for these new online spaces to have a different dynamic where they are literally in the philosophy or the intellectuals for life. Because if you critique my reading of Hegel, for example, well, the whole point is life. Life is the subject. Now, you're not critiquing life. You're actually helping me if that critique, right? So that's where there's a little bit of separation from your work in philosophy that makes you more receptive to critique because it's not all for Hegel, right? Like if all of the work was for Hegel and you critique Hegel, well, that's all I've got. Now I'm going to have a pathological response, right? That's what happens. And that's what's happened to all these university systems. They're so invested in their specialization that when someone critiques it, then they go ballistic. But if it's like, no, I have found a unique ability. I personally, and Hume, Hegel, and all my counter-enlightenment people have found unique resources of explanation for life. That's why you care about them, right? It's for the life. And I think that distinction can go a long way to not having disagreements lead to the collapse of relationships and friendships. And I really do think it is so important if these online spaces are going to not just be University 2.0, but actually be a negation sublation into something different, that avoiding that dynamic is really, really important because it's utterly poisonous. And also also too, like facing critique, the costly critique we're describing is an opportunity to work through negativity. And in fact, very often when somebody says, well, I don't know, like, you had that great video on the dialectic on this idea that the Hegelian can always just incorporate, the dialectic. Well, right there, if you hear that, you as someone who likes Hegel needs to go, well, wait a minute. Oh, I need to not just be a dialectical thinker. I need to go into the ontoepistemology of the dialectic where Hegel's asking, why do concepts often entail their opposite? And what is the commitment that would lead to, right? Well, if you never hear that critique of the dialectic, you may never take that second step that's so important and therefore just end up in a meaningless oscillation back and forth where you don't commit to anything or do anything, right? So that would be the example of where a critique is very beneficial, right? But again, and then I'll just pass it to whoever wants to speak. I think what you're describing hints at a dynamic that is very important for this new work being done online to avoid. If it doesn't avoid it, then it's just college online, and who cares, really? So I think what you're describing is really good.
That was interesting what you were saying about trying to make sure that the internet circles don't become University 2.0, because as you're well aware, we did the idea of the university by Carl Jasper, and one thing that's important is that what he really shows is that there's another side to critique that isn't in the realm of like just pure, dismantling or just like criticizing a set of ideas or institution, but never leaving any room for prescription. A positive critique, or what he's doing is a positive critique. He's like, well, what is the idea of a university? Right. And that's something that not a lot of people do, because it's easy to criticize either, like, let's say the institution of psychiatry, university, critique of ideology, but there's no prescription to it because it's so, like you said, so easy. And one thing that I thought was really interesting about the idea of the university is, as you were pointing out, like what we see today and what's continuously happening are like not just these negative criticisms, but also in the way that this discourse compartmentalizes us and makes us become specialists rather than, let's say, generalists, right? In a sense, we're just treating things like, oh, it's just another occupation, or like, in a sense, like a trade. But even a trade, is something unique in itself too, because of the process of like, a journeyman, a craftsman, and all that stuff. It's like, you're not just like, oh, you learn the basics of like electricity. Now, you could go do whatever you want. Like, there's still a process to it, but yet philosophy is something different, which it has nothing to do with building, a car or, something that has to deal with STEM. It's more of like, I guess to use the term negation of negation, it's a radical negativity of your own worldview, because it's taking your being into account. And that's something that these universities are lacking in creating specializations, particularizing everything, and even dislocating philosophy and the humanities from the sciences. And so they're making us just like people, again, just to reiterate, specialists and not inquiring. Because one thing about the positive critique is that, well, what does it have to do with, education? What does it have to do with learning and the path towards truth seeking, which is important for Jaspers, because that has to deal with one's ontological status, what to be Heideggerian, the existential, analysis of Dasein. And if you don't have that, well, then you'll be spending your life, like even in philosophy, you'll be spending your life, like you said, becoming a Hegel scholar, but not realizing, well, what does dialectic have to do with my own, existence, right? I've located existence, being, non-being as categories, but how does this apply to my life? How does this apply when I'm talking about my worry of, or my fundamental anxiety on my path towards being, and also realizing the distance of my being towards death, right? Taking that into account. And so, I mean, that's all I wanted to say really, but like mainly that there is a distinction between just critique, what we're used to seeing, and then a positive critique, which has to do, well, not only am I dismantling these mystifications, ideologies, etc., but what does this system have to fundamentally do with my being in the world?
No, that very, very well put. And then I'll give it to Michelle. And well, it makes me think of a few things quickly. I almost think like it was a really big mistake to call critical thinking, because that makes it sound like it's criticism thinking. And it seems like here what we're outlining is the difference between criticism, which is kind of cheap, and critique, which is kind of costly, right? And critique is utterly invaluable. And of course, people use words in different ways. I understand, like critique is utterly invaluable, but it's really easy just to stay in criticism because you get all the social benefits. You get to kind of get power in a conversation. And why would you do the extra work to get to critique? Because once you get to critique, it doesn't have as much social benefit. And what's the gain? Unless you genuinely believe that the name of the game of philosophy is, say, truth, living, concrete, and all of that. See, that's the problem. Very often, a lot of the talk of criticism is still operating with the abstraction dichotomy, if you will, actually. Like the people giving the criticism are not, they're not interested to getting to real life just as much as the people presenting the thesis in the university, right? So that's really the thing. Like if by criticism, one means a critique to a kind of application, or to an actuality or a fledging something out, well, that's utterly invaluable. The problem is there's a form of critique that I'm just calling criticism here that actually just is in service of the system. In the same way that, like, at the end of the movie Snowpiercer, the revolution is actually organized by the power as a sort of distraction to keep power in power, right? So it's that kind of operation too. Also, on what you're saying, Carl Jasper is actually extremely important, and it makes me think of Austin Farah. There's a paper he did on verifiable education where he makes the point. He says, well, first off, you have that line from Schopenhauer that I love, where he said, in the past, people would, seek the university because it was a ladder that they would climb toward the sun. Now the university has become where a man comes along with a big bag and fills the bag with the rungs of the ladder, and then he goes around showing off the rungs to people. I love that because I think that is what has happened. The university system is now, let's collect rungs of a ladder and show them off to people. That's really good. And like with Austin Farah, a way to look at it is he's like, hey guys, I promise you Aquinas did not write the Summa Gentilius so that we would do dissertations on the Summa Gentilius. Aquinas did not write these books so that you'd be an Aquinas scholar. He did it because he believed he could help one be pointed toward the beatific vision of God. And that's always important. Like, these people did not write these books going, man, one day there's going to be so many Hegelians out there. Oh boy. No, they've been captured by a problem, really, that they seem reality is not being accurately articulated, and that actually, for some reason, is making the world worse off. Like, there is something that the lack of these ideas causes in the world that makes the world worse. Now, you may not buy that premise, but that's very often how they're kind of thinking. Like you mentioned the dialectic. Once you get that ideas until they're opposite, for example, it's way easier not to fall into some form of political extremism. So, for example, a lot of conservatives in America are like, freedom, that's all that matters. And you got a lot of liberals that are like, equality, that's all that matters. The issue is there is a point where freedom without equality sucks. Do you really want to be free if you don't have conditions of social equality? No, but then there's a condition where equality limits freedom, and then equality starts to suck, right? So that is dialectical, where once you get, oh my gosh, every concept eventually bleeds into another concept. So the name of the game is not what concept is most true, but where is the point of bringing them together in a certain tension, and how do we manage that tension? Now, all of that has to be elaborated on, but the point is that if you get the reality of the dialectic, it makes you more sophisticated when it comes to political matters, right? And what is one of the issues you have in America today? Everyone's talking about political extremism, right? Where you have people with their giant monotheisms, theorisms, as I like to call it, these single theories by which to understand reality, and they have no room for the other, right? And so the political discussion is very sophomoric because it's a melodrama of us versus them, versus let us determine these points of negotiation between these principles. So that would be an example where a philosophical abstraction like the dialectic actually can have practical ramifications in the political realm. But that's a movement from idea to truth, right? That's a movement of idea to life, not just an idea, let's study it and be experts on Hegel so we can get our tenured position. That's a very different kind of mode of thinking.
Yeah, I think what you guys are saying about the university is spot on, that like it doesn't take into account the person who's studying, right? And like it makes me think of the way that I've learned things on YouTube. Like I'm thinking about learning woodworking on YouTube, right? It's like any given task in woodworking, there's going to be 15 different ways to do it, right? And one is not necessarily better than the other, but there are different styles that suit different applications better and suit different people better, right? Like if you search on YouTube how to make a box, you're going to get everything from just like a super rough, somebody breaking down a pallet and nailing them together to like an ornate inlaid, super fancy jewelry box, right? And so it's like there is no one way to make a box, and you have to, as the woodworker, decide, well, like what kind of boxes am I trying to make, and like what tools do I have, and what is my general sort of schema that I'm working in, right? Am I renovating a barn? Am I doing like ornate furniture for people, right? And so you can select the one that is relevant to you. And I feel like what happens at the university is that those different schools are fighting for a position, right? To say like this, on our class of box making, there's going to be a curriculum, and these different schools have to fight for that position. Whereas on YouTube, it's like you can have this guy over here doing it this way and this other guy over here doing it that way, and they're in collaboration with each other. You know, I mean, they'll talk to each other and be like, oh, well, your way might be better if you're doing this, and my way might be better if you're doing this. And there doesn't have to be that kind of like harsh competition between them. And so, yeah, I think what you're saying about the university is spot on, and it does, like, the problem with the YouTube approach, as we've talked about before, is like, how do you get accreditation, right? And how do you get like a certificate? How do you get accreditation? How do you know whether or not somebody has successfully gathered the skills that they need to do a certain job, right? And so that makes it complicated. And as soon as you bring that in, then you do have to start kind of like renegotiating this whole curriculum. And so that's like a really interesting dialectic there. But I'll pass it on there.
No, that's excellent. I'll give it to Michelle here. The Ivan Illich, at the end of his book, Deschooling Education, talks about how basically we need to replace the school system with everyone almost having their own mobile education system at home. And then the laptop came out, and then YouTube came. This is way before any of that. And I think what Ivan Illich predicted is coming to pass. And then, frankly, AI is going to change everything. Like, basically, the high majority of what school does right now is completely irrelevant because of AI. And I don't think the system appreciates how profoundly AI will transform what humans should study, what they should think about, and so on and so forth. It's really not appreciating. It's almost going to be a source of cognitive dissonance in many ways. Definitely on the accreditation. For me, that's where we need to break up the college monopoly on credentials. If there's a 42-year-old single mother who has gotten on YouTube and learned how to code better than some 28-year-old out of an Ivy League, she should get the job. It's completely insane to not have a system of employment testing. And what employment testing is, which was made illegal in '72 because of fears of discrimination and racism, which are valid, but we really didn't solve the problem, because then you just have the problem at college, right? Like, there's such a concern of only letting in suburban middle-class people into school. So you didn't really solve the problem of discrimination. And you removed a way actually for more economic mobility. Because again, it is certainly the case that if you go to Google, they'll give you some like test in order to see if you can program, but it's very legally risky. And that assumes you have the accreditation to even get the test. I'm talking about a radical level of that. We don't even really look at your resume. You sit down and show me you can do it. I don't care what your resume is. You can show me your resume afterwards. Like, literally, that's what I'm talking about. Like, they don't even see your resume. They're like, oh, you think you have what it has? All right, sit down and do it. And maybe before you go to the job, you have to take a test online, so you're not wasting their time when they go down there. You can absolutely automate phase one. But the resume, like, here's the thing. If colleges truly make you the best coders out there, well, then you should be able to beat the crap out of some 42-year-old single mom, right? You know, college, here's the thing. And also bringing back the employment testing as I'm describing it would actually make people go, oh, colleges really do add value. Because look, all the people that go to college are able to pass the test better than people on YouTube, right? Like, colleges right now have a massive legitimization crisis. Like, people are like, what are they for? What do they do? I don't even believe in them. Well, this would be a way. One, it would bring costs down because you've removed the monopoly, right? So costs come down wherever you remove a monopoly. Second, it would actually be a way for colleges to get legitimacy again, or to be destroyed, as they ought to be destroyed if they don't add value, right? That's called capitalism. I thought we believed in that. Oh, wait, no, we don't. We believe in corporatism. Anyway, I'm being mean now. The lack of a decentralized form of accreditation is what's holding all of this back. And I think it's also holding back wealth creation, innovation, technological. I think it's destroyed class mobility. There's no doubt that college as a system has been a horrible source of class paralyzation. And it would open massive doors, and also it would let people pioneer their own educational journeys, really, into a manner that creates their own wealth. So what you pointed out is really, really big. But let me give it to Michelle here. Michelle.
All sorts of good stuff being talked about here. And a lot of it, though, makes me think about, like, it goes back to trust. There's a lot that I feel like this is related to trust. And I think that's why, like, the concept is always, it's always kind of gripped me since I was, just a child. I think, like, witnessing relationships and the hardships that arise in relationships, and then this demand for trust and all of this stuff was like, definitely caused me to think about it a lot. And I think that when it comes to education and learning stuff, like I do wonder if we have like lost trust and almost faith in our own capacity to discern if something is working or not, or like, you know, because I'm thinking about like and it is a true problem, and I don't know what the answer is in terms of accreditation, right? Like, because it is just this complete like buffet of whatever online, right? And it's sort of like, well, where do you go to first? And you got all these different levels, all these different options. And then even if you went through and learned the whole thing, you know, how would you kind of show it to another person? Like, you couldn't just be like, I did get it, I am certified to do this thing. You know, you just like make your own little funny looking plaque thing that you make yourself. I got accredited in this. Yeah. But I think at the same time, it's like, well, make me a table, and then you make the table, and the person's like, oh, I see, you can do this, you know. And I wonder if that element, and I don't know if it's just too like naive of an idea, but it's almost like, just show me by what, let me see by you showing me. And I wonder if this trust element of like, show me is like not, we don't allow for it, because, well, we are also very afraid of failure, right? Like we're very afraid of failure. So it's that goes into it as well. But what I mean to say is like, I do wonder if it could simply come down to this ability to trust our own ability to discern, you know, and to see the fruits of whatever somebody has learned, right? And so, and I think a lot about like education, because, you know, we do homeschool, and I mean, I think to me, one of the main reasons for doing it is actually trusting children's innate ability to learn, and their innate interest and curiosity for life, and not worrying if that's going to be enough, like not worrying if that's enough for them to learn, you know, if that makes any sense. Because there's something almost, what do you need, baby?
I need water to put my feet.
Water for your feet. Okay, let's go outside for a second. I'm gonna go outside with him as I talk. But basically, yeah, it's just this idea of trust, and I do kind of want to relate it a little bit to this idea of like disagreements that can arise philosophically or otherwise between people. I mean, I definitely would. I mean, who doesn't have like, or I'll just speak for myself because I can't speak for other people, but I think nobody wants to like lose valuable relationships in their life, right? Like it's actually kind of mortifying to think about like, oh, well, I just did something that I didn't know hurt the person, and then now like they never want to talk to me again or something, you know. It's scary. But I think at the same time, there it goes back to this trust. Like you kind of have to trust the other person, that even if there were something that were to arise that would be, you know, something of a disagreement or being on different pages or something, that somehow you could work it out together to be able to maintain the relationship, you know. And but like life is inherently a risk. So, you know, it kind of feels like this, you know, it does require a leap of faith and ultimately a trust in the other person, that, you know, even if something were to arise, that you could ultimately work it out together. And at the end of the day, perhaps you could just agree to disagree, you know, but whatever it is you're agreeing or disagreeing upon doesn't matter as much as the relation itself, you know. Like, I think that's, so I guess I'm just thinking about a lot of the threads of trust that are in here. And it's probably also like, it's very, I'll admit it's hard. I know that it's hard. Trust is, because it does require this kind of like terrifying leap, you know, and we always want to epistemologically prove and be sure and secure. Like Javier also brought up in his video, it's this double security, right? It's like the security of your, what did he call it? The life, like your livelihood, right? Like your financial livelihood, but then it's also the security of the relationship, that, you know, that is the means of that worry, right? That potential means of that worry, you know, oh, I'm worried. Are you going to have a job? Are you going to be able to do something with your what you're choosing for your life path? So it's like this double security, that it is this kind of, ultimately it is a kind of obsession with security that often undermines the very thing we're hoping to secure. It's a very strange irony, I think. But really, like, it does have to, I mean, there is no other choice but to trust. And yet it's the very scariest thing to do. And yet it's the most ontologically at play already, right? It's already happening. We're already trusting, but we just we don't feel sure that it's there. So then we have to kind of epistemologically try to prove it, but we will never be satisfied. We will never get enough. Like Danielle was saying, like, we'll never get enough evidence of whatever, you know. And so ultimately you have to leave it at that risk and trust in the other person. in terms of like a relationship having, you know, being forever. So I don't know, that I just wanted to bring up trust here because I think it's really important. When we're talking about education and trusting ourselves, you know, trusting ourselves and trusting each other, to be able to like navigate life, and it, you know, philosophy being a life thing and not just merely all of our own divinations of what our philosophies are. The real core is life itself, right? And life, I believe, is forever, you know. And so ultimately, like, in a sense, we can be secure in that. Like, we can be secure in that. But we also have to trust that we don't, you know, it's like life is given and it's taken away too, right? In the finite sense, like in the fleshly sense. So we kind of hold this posture of like, well, actually philosophy should never, to me, like, I'm not interested in a philosophy that would end relationships. That's my personal idea on it, but you know, other people could disagree. But like, I'm not interested in being so dogmatic about philosophy that it actually, you know, hampers and hinders relationship itself. Because ultimately, to me, like, the whole reason of doing philosophy is for life, and what is life but relations, right? So, anyways, I just wanted to say that really quickly.
That was great, yeah, and it brings back this whole idea of accreditation. Like, you know, the employment test works well for knowledge sets that are very clearly defined and clearly applicable, right? Like coding or building a table. When it comes to something like philosophy or, you know, the humanities, literature, things like that, it's much harder to prove that you have competency within that domain. And it's not even like, even to speak of it as competency is not quite the right word for it. You know what I mean? Like somebody, a masterful professor of literature, it's like, what is their competency exactly? It could be writing, you know what I mean? But if it's like studying something and just having a general understanding of it, it's much harder to tell whether or not somebody is qualified, right? And so you can either say, well, like, we should only focus on the application of these knowledge sets, and say, like, which I think is valid to say that, like, a philosophy as the study of how to live well, basically, is like, if a philosopher's life is a mess, then we probably shouldn't trust their philosophy, right? But on the other hand, like, some great philosophy, I think, has come out of some pretty dysfunctional people, right? And so it's like, well, so how do you judge, right? And it comes back to what Michelle is saying about trust. And it's sort of like this ultimate leap of faith of just like, oh, I just trust that what this guy's saying is true. But it's also, I think it also calls a certain sort of like, you can't fall into it completely, right? Like once you sort of think about this, it's like, you can't just follow a guru and just like fully commit your judgment over to another, right? So there's kind of this delicate balance of like, if you're studying something like philosophy, how do I discern what philosophy is good or not? It's hard because philosophy is there to teach you how to discern, right? Like going into philosophy, you sort of have to take I feel like the first step in philosophy is realizing that your own discernment is flawed, right? If you don't have that realization, you're never going to enter into the field of philosophy, right? So you start with like, okay, I don't know how to discern exactly, and so I need to turn out of myself to something else in order to inform my discernment, right? But as soon as you do that, it's like, well, whose discernment but mine am I going to trust to tell me who to turn to inform my discernment, right? And so it's this infinite just conflict of mind, and I think you just have to live with it, you know what I mean? And coming back to this idea of worry, it's like the way to turn worry on its head is just to say like, okay, yes, you should be worried about me, you know what I mean? Like I'm doing something dangerous and like risky, and like, you know, would you want me to live a life that you didn't worry about me at all? You know what I mean? Like what kind of life would that be if I just stayed in some safe little bubble where you never had to worry about me? It's like, no, yeah, you should be worried. And worry is simply like focused attention on something, right? To be worried about something just means like your attention is constantly being called back to it, and you're trying to figure out how to mitigate the risk. Which, if you're doing something risky, like you should be worried, you know what I mean? The trick though is just not to be consumed by the worry, and to have it in its place and to be like, okay, yes, I'm worried about this, but I'm still going to go for it. And like, I'm confident that even though I'm worried, I'm confident I can do it. Right. And here's why I'm confident. And so that's that's all I got to say on that. I don't know. I was going to bring it around somehow, but I'm not sure. I'll pass it on.
No, that's outstanding. You know, a few things. First, the point that you bring up, this is actually like one of the reasons for me, like there's something like philosophy seems necessary, because there's a form of worry that's anxiety, which is bad because it's this self-relating negativity. But then there's a form of worry that seems to be more like wisdom, in the sense of, oh, you want to go bungee, you want to go, you know, hunt, you want to go do something dangerous, dirt bike or something down a mountain. Oh, are you sure? Like there's a form of worry there that's also more like wisdom. And actually, in a lot of our fiction, the distinction between worry and wisdom, is how we put it, is like really huge, because it's really hard to tell those differences. But one of them seems to have to do with a certain paralysis anxiety, where another one is a discernment of the facticity or the reality of the situation, and therefore you take it seriously. You could call that care versus worry. You could call it worry versus concern, but there's a distinction here. But that ability to kind of multiply terms, not frivolously, but necessarily, and determine what is the scope range, like how many terms do we need to multiply to where it doesn't just become an endless multiplication for no reason, but also we do need a few more terms because there are differences between these things that are really slight. And those real slight differences seem to be a lot of what philosophy is in the business of. Not, you know, at least what we're doing, not academic. It does make me think that it's more of an art form or a skill. Like you have those really fine wine tasters who are able to tell the difference between these very slight differences of red wine, for example, where other people are like, I don't taste the difference. But these other people are like, oh yeah, this is 1974, blah, 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 blah. You're like, oh, it seems akin to that skill. In at least one part of philosophy is an akinment to that, has something to do with that taste, of which is practically really important. Because if you don't know that difference, and for you all worry is the same, well, then you could be engaged in that anxiety producing worry that destroys your relationships that you define as love, right? Like if you don't know the difference between worry, as I'm using it, and wisdom, then you may think you're being wise when you're actually just being anxious. And therefore, in the name of wisdom, you destroy all your relationships because you carry yourself in an anxious way. That's why this stuff seems to matter so much, because literally the failure to have that distinction between the concepts changes how you practice yourself in a relationship. And this is where, to me, we're talking good, you know, true philosophy, as David Hume would put it, versus bad philosophy, which is what we see at the university system. And that, to me, like one of the reasons I like that to me is practical, but it's a funny kind of practice because it's a pragmatism of ideas. Like like what we're talking about there is literally having the wrong idea of what worry is has a practical impact. And that's where we talked about before, Hybrid. That's where Marcis Blondel wants to say action is not the same as pragmatism. He's like action has a philosophical meta dimension. And he was like, William James and all you people, I like what you're saying, but you're missing something really important here, because there's no such thing as practice without an idea of what constitutes practice. And that's what I think we see here. The question on what you raised about the employment testing, yeah, it's one of the reasons why I think like the employment testing for the philosophy of the humanities, it seems like it's more of the oral test, like having a conversation with the person and seeing if they're able to actually have the conversation, or even like, all right, have you created something? Like you're like, I'm a really, really good philosopher. Oh, well, let me read your book. I haven't written a book. Oh, interesting. Like it would seem to me under those conditions, the more philosophical or the humanities realms, the test is going to be more in the oral, the conversation, and literally what have they made? Like they're literally a YouTube channel. Like it's not the same as a resume, because here it's like literally there they are. I can watch their stuff and see what they've made, as opposed to saying, I went to Harvard, I did this. I can't watch you at Harvard. I can't watch how you carried yourself in class at Berkeley, but I can perhaps read your book and I can watch your videos, right? So that to me is a much fairer resume. It's more like what I'm talking about here. I see a change from the resume to the portfolio. You know, I worked as a photographer for a long time, and nobody cares. You say, oh, I got all these awards at photography fairs. And I don't have a portfolio though. Oh, well, I'm not going to hire you then. Like no photographer would be like, look at my awards, but I don't have a portfolio. Everyone would be like, oh, okay. Like everyone knows a photographer, it's great to have awards, but I also expect you to have a gallery on your website. I also expect you to have a portfolio, right? I think that's the standard that needs to basically be brought up to the humanities, which in the past We didn't have YouTube. We didn't have the internet. It was more difficult to record. So I understand why the accreditation system was different. But there's kind of now, I think we can have a more sophisticated and more accurate system of accreditation, if you will, by having basically available, the average person can make a kind of portfolio. And look, if you want to teach at friggin' UVA or whatever, you ought to have a portfolio. That's a nice job or whatever, right? So to me, that's more fair, frankly. And it's also more fair because, again, it's more democratic in the sense that a 42-year-old single mom can make a YouTube video, but she may not be able to go to Harvard because she'd have to move, have to get the money, need all the time. Also, she has a job. That's less democratic, right? So to me, what you're doing in all of that is opening up mobility, like economic, socioeconomic, educational mobility, class mobility. Those are the things you're opening up by, I mean, for me, the monopoly on credentials is like the #1 monopoly holding things back. Like #1. I'd have to think about that a little bit, but I'm pretty sure it is. Because you can't have you can't have class mobility if literally the accreditation is monopolized, right? And you say, no, it's not monopolized because everyone can go to college. No, they freaking can't. That's ridiculous. And it's certainly generationalism. It favors younger people who have less response, who are more free in many respects. Well, that's kind of a discrimination according to age, right? It's completely nuts. The last things I'll say, and then I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak. There's also something funny to me, like philosophy seems so abstract and blah, blah, blah. To me, to like give people jobs based on resumes are like the ultimate abstraction. And we decide people's jobs based on resumes. Like, it's ridiculous. Like, that is such an abstraction. Wanted to say that. And the other thing too, there's something about like the search in philosophy for grounds, or to make sure, how do you know the world is real? How do you know we're not in a simulation? All of that to me is a failure to trust reality. And if you want reality to earn your trust before you believe it's there, it never can. And so you end in these endless philosophy deconstructions of looking for an absolute ground, because the issue is that the absolute ground cannot earn your trust. Therefore, it will never be there. So basically, here's the key. For David Hume, good philosophy assumes the concrete common life world, and philosophy is in service of the common life world, because in order to critique reality, you have to assume reality. Like, so for example, David Hume's like, if you say, well, how do I know that language communicates? You have to assume language is communicating to ask that language communicates. David Hume's like, that's stupid. And if you basically spend all your philosophy time asking questions like that, which he argued basically is what everyone was doing, then it not only does it not accomplish anything, it destroys life. It destroys life. Because if reality has to prove itself before you'll live, you never live. And therefore reality seems like, indeed, it couldn't prove itself because your life sucked, which then proves that reality sucked. See how it's a self-fulfilling prophecy? Like, the world has to prove itself before you'll trust that you ought to live it. Well, then you never see reason to live it. And therefore you were really wise, not to trust in life. You see, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so for David Hume, what that ultimately means, and then I'll pass it on, is philosophy should never philosophize about premises that it must assume in order to be possible. Otherwise, it eats itself. And that means basically philosophy is a form of an art form, skill, action. How should we act in the world? What skills do we need in relationship? What is the art of being human? Ergo, what's the difference between worry and wisdom? What's the difference between, say, love and love that enables, love that possesses? We can go through all of these different things, right? And also the whole discussion of employment testing, monopoly on credentials, that's a kind of philosophical reflection because it's meta. Accreditation as a concept is meta. It's a concept. How should it operate in the society? How could you open it up? Right there, you have a certain analysis that is thinking through the idea, right? Now, it's a philosophical concept that is mixed with the sociological and the economic, but right there would be a form of where you're using philosophy. And David Hume would say that's using philosophy for common life because you're trying to open possibilities up to more people. You see, it's in service of life as opposed to bottlenecking middle class, making it basically to where middle class suburbia gets the majority of jobs, right? So that's in service of common life, because you're trying to say that more people would have access to things from their unique particularity in their unique common life. So those distinctions of the Scottish, and then I'll give it to you once. Those distinctions of the Scottish Enlightenment, I think, are just such a big deal.
No, yeah, I think that's great what you're saying, and I think the distinction you brought up at the beginning of what you're just saying is between like wisdom and worry, or like worry and care. I think that's super important, and it's like that's a way for somebody who worries a lot to sort of like transform their tendency into a positive action. I think is to ask like, how can I use this emotional energy to further the task at hand, right? And when it comes to philosophy, like I totally agree with you that you have to like if philosophy begins to like deconstruct its own grounding, then it just eats itself, and it's just this pointless intellectual game that doesn't do anything for anyone. And it's very frustrating when people start doing that, because like the ground of your reality is given to you, right? Phenomenologically, like we live within a certain something, like there is something in front of us and it has a certain character, and we can recognize that character without doing any sort of philosophy. And so you have to start from there, what I mean? And so, I think I've said this before, maybe in one of our conversations, but there's that famous quote, I think it's from Bertrand Russell. He said that the whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so sure of themselves, and wiser men so full of doubt, right? And I think that there's truth to that, but there's also the other side of that, which is like, well, maybe these so-called wise men are really just a bunch of worrywarts who are just like too cowardly to actually take a stand and do anything, right? How wise are these wise people really if they're letting the fools and the fanatics run the world, right? And so, you have to be philosophical and question things without letting it undermine the task at hand, I think is really important. And coming back to this idea of like the problem with accreditation, I definitely agree with you. The portfolio trumps the resume here, and it should what you're really emphasizing that I agree with is that any discipline, even the humanities, should ultimately be oriented towards a creative end, right? And if it's not, then it's kind of just nonsense. It's just superfluous, what I mean? But I do think I would like the devil's advocate in my mind is saying like, well, but in order to be creative, like you have to be creative from somewhere that may not necessarily manifest, like you may not be able to see the direct connection between being a great philosopher and like manifesting this tangible end, right? And so I do think we need to leave a space for like the non-practical skills, and like the non-practical skills, I think is the right word as we're talking. That philosophy is a skill, but not every skill is practical. Maybe that's what I'm trying to get at here. But I'll pass it back to you.
The point that you're getting at is very, very good. The first thing on in Yeats in the Second Coming has a line where he's like, in the foolish are filled with passional intensity, while the wise are filled with paralyzing doubt or something. And Bertrand Russell has a great line as well. Because maybe the wise people just like to think of themselves as wise because they're afraid. How convenient that, that the lack of action is evidence of wisdom, right? Maybe it's evidence of fear and cowardliness. Don't be so quick. Now, there's another form where maybe someone's inactive because they are wise and therefore are not involved in politics because they see that politics is a snake eating its own tail. Again, those are all distinctions that have to be looked through from a meta-analysis, and ultimately you have to check your own heart, right? Like philosophy, like you are not using philosophy properly if you are not checking your own motivations. Like that's almost like a groundwork test. Do you use your philosophy to check your own motivations? Which of course is incredibly hard because we're full of self-deception, even when we think we're overcoming self-deception, and it's a daily practice, and you don't do, it's like constant, right? It's a daily constant habit on what that looks like. Now we'd have to go through the details of that, but really, philosophy has a lot to do with fighting self-deception, fighting the kind of puffing up confidence that makes you better than other people or sure of yourself, and things like that. But it also doesn't paralyze you where you're justified to not act. But again, those are all the fine distinctions that have to be worked through. On what you were saying about that space, to me, by all means, your hobbies are great. Like, people have philosophical hobbies. The question is, what should people get paychecks for? Like, what should be the criteria of a job, right? And that's where you start saying, oh, you like to do philosophy. Great. That's a great hobby. Oh, you want to get paid to do philosophy. Oh, okay. Well, now there's a higher standard, right? And in fact, if someone doesn't go through the phase of the hobby, then they will never get to the skill level to do the thing professionally, right? Now, the issue is, it's like, well, wait a minute. What if people can't do the philosophy hobby because they have to go to work and unload trucks? Great. There's a higher likelihood their philosophy won't suck because they had to interact with the real world. In fact, I think there's something to be said about forcing an individual to navigate the pursuit of a hobby with real life demands that greatly increases the likelihood that the philosophy doesn't get lost in a self-relating intellectual self-congratulations, if you will, right? And in fact, if they have to, say, figure out how to maintain the hobby when they're not getting paid for it, then you find out if they really, truly like it. Like, if they truly believe in it. I think there are a ton of professors who are English professors because they had nothing better to do. They don't actually love literature. They just did it because it helped them avoid a real job. And I think that applies to a lot of things. And that's why they're all freaking deconstructionists who spend all their time destroying the literary canon that they supposedly love so much. Oh, isn't that nice? So many professors strike me as not having any love of their field, where it is just a job. Now, don't get me wrong. There's something to be said about the guy that goes and unloads trucks and doesn't really like unloading trucks down, but puts his head down and makes it happen, right? There's a place for that. That's not the place for the humanities, though. If you are in the that is a different field where the humanities, you must believe in it because it is so deeply tied to the subject. Unloading a truck does not need your emotional support to happen. You can hate your job and unload a truck. And unloading the truck, the effectiveness of unloading the truck is not contingent upon your belief in liking the unloading of truck, right? But when it comes to philosophy, humanities, ideas, oh yes, it very much matters because those are about the person. Those are the heart work, I guess you could say, the subject work on the subject, right? So if you got people teaching fields that are all about working on the subject who it's just a job to, then the fields die. Oh, wait a minute, they are dying. Nobody's English majors, philosophy departments are going bankrupt. They're all collapsing because you have people teaching them for whom it is mostly a job. And so they don't really care about it, but they get paid to do it, and it's what they're good at, right? So they kind of have a, like, put your head down, blue collar mentality in a field that is literally affected by the very disposition of the people who are in it. You see, and that's the difference. As you move to abstract thinking, the more nature and notion, to use Hegelian terms, come together. Okay, object and subject come together, right? Over here, when you're unloading trucks, subject and object are pretty divided, right? The existence of the object is not contingent upon how you feel about it, right? But as you move into the humanities, the philosophy, the divide between subject and object closes. And so the very subjective state of the professor and teacher absolutely impacts the field. And that's where having a criteria of perhaps going to a phase where it's a hobby, and then we find out if you actually care about it, can be quite useful because it probably increases the probability by which the professor who is engaged in the task is actually going to teach it well. So to me, what's getting at, and we arguably, Chetan, good to see you, my friend. And arguably, we don't even have a hobby culture anymore. Like, people, we have a consuming entertainment culture, right? Where people come home from work and they gel and then they go back to work. It used to be people had hobbies, they had skills, they did things as a culture. I'm not trying to be a nostalgic idealist, but you had more of a hobby culture. I mean, people were part of like Lions clubs and different things as well, right? That went away. Neil Postman is good on that. Bowling Alone is Robert Putnam. All the sociologists are good. They talk about the death of social capital, the death of the hobby culture. So that's all good. Well, that could come back as well, because if indeed you want to pass the oral exam or have the portfolio to get paid to do philosophy, well, then going through the hobby phase to show that, or to get paid to teach art, would have a very useful function. So to me, and then I'll give it back to one, these are the kind of socio-economic dimensions that can be added that open up possibility for people. So for me, what you're saying about the space of the useless, in a sense, and that's not an insult, but it's like it doesn't have immediate application. And there's a whole tradition of philosophers arguing for the defense of the useless. I think about Binda, Julian Binda, who says the moment we're like, oh, the humanities have to have use, there's a tyranny there. So that's a danger. But then we also have the question of, what is the standard by which to determine the job? Like, who gets the job, who gets hired, right? And this is where I think you can see the hobby playing the role into the employment testing structure, rather than be, say, an oral exam or showing off a portfolio. Does that make sense, Mr. Fishman?
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I definitely agree with you. I think that's a really good point about how, like, if you want to leave a space for the useless, then don't try and bring that into something like a university, which has a use and is operating within the realm of money and certificates. And, it has, like, keep that within the hobby realm. But if you want to get paid for it, then you got to be able to show some sort of use. I think that's I don't know, I'm still kind of mulling it over, but I think that's a good way to think about it.
And I should clarify, like, the issue, and Sanduni, we're having all sorts of fun today. And the issue too is, by all means, like, if the university system had accreditation through, I think I froze. There I am. I'm back. So if the university system had a system of accreditation that is different from, hello, Sanduni. How are you doing, my dear? It is good to see you. I like the Virginia flag. That's very, very nice.
I'm well, thanks. Sorry I'm late.
No trouble at all. We're having a lot of fun. And Sanduni, we just had a lovely conversation about some pieces on subjectivity and art and thoughts and different things. Sanduni is magical. But no, it's like, and it should be noted that the issue is when you have a university system by which one enters through a there's a difference between a university system that has a monopoly on credentials and a university system of which has to compete with other ways of getting accreditation that wants to say, oh, well, actually, you can learn the useless here in ways that is better than YouTube. So come here. It would also have a much fairer market price because you don't have the monopoly on credentials that is in operation there. And that completely kind of transforms the dynamic that is at play. So the problem is now you have a university that's like, oh, you should take the humanities, but this is about the job you get. So yeah, you really shouldn't be an English major, but we'll act like you should be, knowing darn well that you're supposed to use it to get accreditation in another field. That creates a pathological relationship in the university between the useless and the practical. And until you remove the college monopoly on credentials, you cannot have a more healthy relationship between the useful and the useless, right? Because you don't want to waste all that money that you went into the college system, and you don't want to get a bad accreditation that can't get you a good job. So by introducing a new sort of way to get accreditation through the employment testing, through the oral, if you have a university that says, hey, come for us for 4 years, we at the University at Virginia teach literature. Okay, well, I know that that's not my only opportunity for my entire life to get accredited at a good job, right? So I may do that, and I know what it's there for. And if indeed it teaches me how to really do literature, then I'll be able to pass the employment test at the high school or the other job because I went to that place, you see? So by separating the accreditation from the university experience, that also allows for a more like honest understanding of what the university exists to do. Whereas right now it's very, very strange and kind of pathological, where it's like, no, it's not about getting a job, but it is about getting a job, but it's not about getting a job. And it's very, very, very strange, right? By removing the monopoly on credentials, that you would have a much healthier relationship.
I remembered what I was going to say before. You just reminded me of like this. You're talking about how there are certain things like the humanities in which subject and object are very much united. And then there's other activities like unloading a truck in which subject and object are divided, right? Where it's like, you don't have to love your job to be an effective truck unloader. But if you're not really passionate about the humanities, you're not going to be good at it, right? And it just like it I think that's so true, and I think that it's important for the development of a person to have like both of those things in their life, right? It just made me think of the way how like in Judaism, the rabbi historically, and still today, but certainly historically, if there was one rabbi in the town, that rabbi was also your butcher. Yeah, I mean, and so it's like you have this extreme split between like the high law. He's supposed to be the guy who knows about the high, lofty theological principles in which subject and object are very tightly knit, but then he's also your butcher, right? So it's like, and it's the whole task of Judaism, I think, is to connect those two things and to bring the one into the other, so that subject and object are not so divided in the mundane task. And so, but I think it's important for, that's why I think it's important for a human being to have both those things in their life, so that they can, if you just get focused on the mundane, as we've been talking about this whole time with the common life and going off to the mountains and then back to the common life, unless you have that dialectic, you're going to get either caught up in the mundane or caught up in the lofty abstractions. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say there.
No, that's excellent. And forgive me if my internet gets funny. It gets windy here, and out in the country, wind destroys the internet, alas. But what's interesting right now is the issue is, one of the reasons I think people spend all their free time consuming as opposed to like, dare I say, enriching or thinking or learning or whatever, is because you're like, what's the point? I can't get a job studying philosophy. So the incentive to do hobbies is gone, basically, if we just use the hobby language, right? But if you had an employment testing society, well, then hobbies, the useless, could always turn into the used, right? And this is what's also very important about that. In a way, by doing that, you actually suggest that the birthplace is always the quote unquote useless. Like the origin is also useless. You actually honor the useless more so because it is precisely in what you do in your free time that can clearly connect how your life course goes, right? Today, basically, your life is decided by what you do, quote unquote, at work, right? Like what you do at college, what you do at work, that's your career. That determines who you are, right? Well, no surprise there's so much reductionism then. No surprise then there's so much quote unquote meaning crisis, or people like, what are the point of life, or boredom? Because basically the only way to be yourself or to make the most of yourself is what you do at work, which tends to be owned by somebody else, or an accreditation system of which then you leave and it's like, what did that have to do with my life? But if you had an employment structure, an employment testing structure that then brought back the hobby, or at least created avenues of the hobby, then your life is always on. Not just that you're always forming yourself and always expanding your horizon of possibilities, because what you do in your free time, ergo hobbies, can literally transform what opens up to you and what you can do, right? And so, and all of that then is what emerges out of the useless time, right? And so that actually honors the useless as the birth of civilization. Whereas right now, the birth of civilization is the useful, what you do at work, what you do on, and that reduces everything because those functions are inherently linear relative to the needs of the society. And so what you do is you make the human being in the image and likeness of the society, as opposed to make the society in the image and likeness of the human, right? To make society in the image and likeness of the human, you must make primary the useless. And that makes sense because ultimately humans are not reducible to means, right? What is a human? The whole reason humans have value is because they're kind of quote unquote useless. Like God doesn't use mankind like a tool. There's a relationship with mankind, right? Now that doesn't mean you don't have tasks, but they're the tasks of Eden, right? They're not toil, they're an excitement. That's like a hobby in the sense of you're actually enriched by the task, right? And we've had that discussion between work and toil and all those different things, right? So unless we make, basically, and then I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak, basically the college monopoly on credentials is leading to a society that is made in the image and likeness of use, which then results in the human being made in the image and likeness of society. Whereas if you broke up that monopoly, that would transform people's relation to time. It would make the birthplace of society the useless per se. And that would mean society is made in the image and likeness of the human, which would help us avoid all of the reductionism that seems to be so destructive today. So again, it's crazy to think, but I really do think that the monopoly on credentials held by the university system has a massive impact on what people talk about: the meaning crisis, the mental health crisis, the reductionism, the boredom. That monopoly right there is having an insane amount of negative impacts on the society. And it's quite silly. And even if there was a historic moment where it was justified, given the technological restraints, today, we no longer have the same technological restraints because we have YouTube, we have the portfolio instead of the resume, et cetera, so forth. We have the ability to engage in education like never before. That historic moment where the classical forms of accreditation were more acceptable, just given the restraints of the facticity, are no longer so acceptable. And this is where you have to have a kind of Hegelian negation sublation. It's time for that sort of shift, which if we don't, you're going to continue to have all of these negative consequences we see today in the terms of the mental health crisis, the meaning crisis. And I'll note a reason why those start to appear today, even if you're under the same constraints, is because now you know it could be different. See, that's the key. In the past, you didn't have the internet, you didn't have the way to learn, so it didn't bother you, even if the accreditation systems were no desire, because it was, the term Hegel would use, it was part of your determination, right? Like it was part of the determination, and things don't bother you that you don't have control over so much, right? What bothers you is what you have control over. So as technology advances and you can move away from previous forms of accreditation, if we do not move away from them, then it bothers us. You see, that's when it unleashes all of the mental health crises and different problems, because it doesn't have to be that way. And therefore, the fact it is that way then becomes a source of agony and social turmoil and social pathologies and different collapses. So this is why in Hegel, and then I'll give it to everyone to speak, that's why you have, as things change, you must change with them. Because if you do not, then the failure of the change becomes a burden. It becomes a source of a different kind of agony. But I'll give it to who wants to speak.
Well, hello, it's good to be here. And what are some subjects we're talking about? It's great, especially because Daniel and I had this conversation earlier this week about thoughts, because that's the hot topic, the new book. So I hope you all have your copies of Thoughts. I'm here doing the marketing, but I'm being biased, but still. And I think it's very interesting that, you talk about academia and objectivity and subjectivity. And, we discussed three chapters. And the most interesting one that I really liked was The Unexamined Life Isn't a Life Worth Living. And I think that's a beautiful chapter. And I think it's very relevant when talking about academia. It's like the first sort of prerequisite thing that you need to check on a list when pursuing academia is, okay, how much am I going to make? Where am I going to work? It's not whether I will like this subject or will this, change who I am or help me evolve as a person. And I think that's one of the many problems in modern day academia, and how students are pressurized to choose a subject or a field that will potentially be rewarding financially. And, with status quo, it's not about, can I truly apply what I like into my day-to-day life? Can I make a life out of it? Can I create art? And yes, perhaps, philosophy and literature and art isn't everyone's cup of tea. But then again, there's someone could go out there and read medicine and then end up becoming, a gym instructor because, it wasn't for them, medicine wasn't for them, but they were pressurized, or rather influenced by society, to choose a certain way of living. And I think another thing about being objective or subjective is, people can't find the middle ground. You either have to be really subjective or really objective. And I think Daniel discusses it brilliantly in the chapter on the term subjective. It's one of the shortest chapters, so it's a very quick read. And I believe it's available online on Medium as well. Yes, I've got all of it covered, Daniel. But I think talking about reductionism, that is a conversation that I've had very often with both Michelle and Daniel, online and in person, every time I've visited the farm. And I think it's such a substantial problem in the modern day. You meet some really intelligent people, and by intelligent, I mean people with the right credentials, having gone to these prestigious universities and, accumulated all of these academic accolades. But it's more like you're just shooting information back and forth. You know, you're able to state facts, state figures, state historic events. But if you sit down and ask them, has any of this really influenced your mind or the way you live your life? There is no answer there. And the conversation is cut short, or you move on to the next best thing where you know something in common and you just shoot across each other and just, you know, share facts and figures, and it becomes like trivia. I think the point of the matter is when you sort of, I mean, I'm going to come back to the unexamined life as in life worth living, because, you know, it resonates with me deeply, and I believe it'll have an effect on all of you when you do get the chance to read it. You might have already done that, I don't know, but I think you should if you haven't. I think the best part about discussing an unexamined life is, first of all, defining how you wish to examine it, and what does that mean for you and the people in your life, the people that are supposed to be in your life, and how do you decide that? Sometimes you go off to college and you get this degree, and the immediate question they ask you is, oh, what's next? What are you going to achieve next? What's the next objective? There's no subjectivity in that. Are you going to go off and do some soul searching? Because, you know, that's frowned upon. You can't have a hobby. You're supposed to follow a certain path and, you know, reach all of these pedestals that people put you on. Sometimes if you go to a really prestigious university, you're immediately put on a pedestal, and they expect you to be the stereotypical person that's, you know, been to this university. And that means you have to be accomplished, or, you know, you failed. And I think that connects very well with the unexamined life is in life worth living. And Daniel and I talk about this because we talked about, you know, how do you decide if you fully examined your life? Is it through the experiences? Is it through the countries you've been to, the things you've seen, how many people you know? How often do you see people? Because that's what determines how examined, how well-versed, how cultured a person is. Because that's what, you know, technology and the media tells us to do. We're supposed to know all these things because it's out there. But what about just being subjective in the way you pursue things and the way you entertain things? Why is it so prominent that all of these things have to be set objects? And I also feel in modern literature, the definition of subjectivity versus objectivity has changed profoundly, because it's one or the other. Because nobody has a neutral ground, and almost having a neutral ground is considered wrong. So those are some of my thoughts. And yes, go buy your copy of the thoughts, please, and thank you.
Well, you were very sweet, Sanduni. Thank you very much for your comments.
Thank you for entertaining me, really.
You succeeded. Very, very nice. And I definitely think there is this funny way in which you go to like a prestigious university, and then you're almost a slave to the fact you went to that university, because then there are these expectations, and if you don't do it, you failed, and it creates this kind of string that you're pulled on, which you were supposed to be free. And then you know, if you go to university, you'll be able to do whatever job you want and blah, blah, blah. But there's a certain like actually force that can be brought into that, right? Which goes to show you that it's never a simple freedom determinism kind of thing, right? These things are always mixed, and it matters on the socioeconomic system that one is describing and things like that. I should also note that when we talk about the useless as the source of life, another phrase for that, funny enough, the useless is the emergent. Like this kind of sum total thing that cannot be reduced that gives rise to something. And the issue is the moment you use the emergent, you reduce it to the non-emergent. You reduce the whole to its part, right? So the kind of uselessness we have been describing is the wholeness of life that cannot be used without making it something less than it is, right? And so what has kind of happened in culture today, in society today, by making the useful the standard of culture, then we've reduced society to a part of the human experience as opposed to the whole of the human experience. And so then, of course, society becomes reductionist because it reduces the human to that very part, right? And this tends to be analytical thought, you know, et cetera, so forth, things that get you a job in the white collar form. And I'll give it to Chetan here. And I think also the issue is, in that structure, an examined life becomes something that, have you figured out how to reduce yourself? Like, this is a big problem. Like, without philosophy, you cannot determine what is meant by examination. So you end up absorbing the definition of examination, which becomes to make sure you're on the track to have a successful career, make sure you're on the track to fit into the socioeconomic order. And so then having the examined life actually becomes a kind of form of totalitarianism, like soft totalitarianism, where you force yourself into that structure. So then but this gets into why philosophy matters, because you need philosophy by which to determine how you define examination, to make sure that when you engage in the examined life, you are doing it in terms of a definition of examination that is not feeding into the socioeconomic system, right? So without philosophy, you can't even make sure that how you understand examination is not actually in service of the reductionist society. So then you have to have that meta move, and I lost. Without philosophy, you cannot understand what you mean by examination. And so you end up, the examined life becomes the one that makes sure it fits into the socioeconomic system, right? Which then, as we've said before, is reductionist. So then the examined life is the life that makes sure it's reduced, which is one of the great horrific ironies that is now occurring today. And to avoid that mistake, you need philosophy to make sure examination is not defined in terms of a reductionist ontology, a reductionist concept of what is the human, to make sure that you're actually not falling into that mistake. But Chetan.
Yeah, this question of useful and useless actually is extremely interesting one. It's something which I've been myself struggling with, so I thought to just share it with you all in that sense. One of the philosophers actually who sort of discusses this problem is actually Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt coming from Walter Benjamin in that tradition. And for her, the argument of usefulness actually connects to what you call the social realm. For her, this idea of social realm taking over all other realms in that sense is a symptom of, society sort of moving away from useless objects into all objects having some kind of immediate use. And if you think about it, the central issue behind sort of discarding the useless object or useless, sort of not caring for things that do not have immediate use is that human beings sort of develop their relationship to the outside, the radical outside, through uselessness. Direct use can never give us a relationship to the outside in that sense. Am I right? Because if you know a use of something, then it's already on the inside. It's already on the scale in which something can be calculated. Something radically creative can only come from a space which cannot be immediately calculated. That means it has to come from a space which is useless in that sense. That's the essential problem. That uselessness is not a good thing because it is actually useless. Uselessness is a good thing precisely because you don't know what comes out of it. There's a realm of unpredictability involved in that sphere. And if we take this problem of, and say in Lacan, this becomes the problem to relationship to the real. This outside is never really out itself. This outside is a relationship to that part of object which escapes symbolization, the part of the real in that sense, right? And that relationship with what escapes symbolization cannot be formed without a minimum of in some senses surplus which cannot be accounted for our immediate drives. So this relationship with drive and desire gets formed through this idea that you have to delay the satisfaction of the drive. It is in that delaying, and that delaying is only possible through useless object. Because if the object is useful, your drive will get satisfied immediately. It's only through that delay in satisfaction that our reality gets constitutive of its. That's how Freud was thinking about it. And I think it is in this structure we need to start thinking about this problem of the useless. Not useless as simply being useless, but useless something which needs to be affirmed completely for its own radical function in our lives in some sense. Yeah.
No, that's a beautiful comment. And well, it makes me think also, like in that, as Sandy brought up, this subject-object divide. If I'm a subject, then what exists is just subjective, right? That means it's my subjective view. Well, right there, it's automatically framed that reality is used. It is something that you experience. It's being used for your subjective experience, right? So there's already a priming there that's kind of problematic with the notion that all knowledge is subjective. And then the problem becomes is everything is a subject to you. You kind of own it. You actually have a control to it. So it's this weird double move I was talking with Sandy about, where everything is subjective, which means that, everything is subjective, which means it's just my opinion. Oh, and it can't force me to care about it. Like, it's just my opinion and the world can't force me to care about it because it's just subjective, right? So you control the world and then simultaneously free yourself of the responsibility of that world you control. So it's like the worst of all possible things, because everything is something you use and then disregard. Like it's like trash almost. I use it and I use it as trash that occurs. And so not only then do you get when there's no useless, that means there's no space outside calculation, which has a lot of trouble. But then if everything is subjective, then it's either thrown away as trash, or then it's just, if I'm oriented by the socioeconomic system, everything has value in so much as it's calculated, therefore reduced. So you have a double possibility, two possibilities there that are so problematic that seem to be very, very widespread. And then I'll pass it to who wants to speak. I think also on the delay of satisfaction is so interesting because, traditionally a lot of people would say character kind of develops where you have to, delay satisfaction, avoid instantaneous satisfaction, and so on and so forth. That very delay suggests that the world is something that you have to make room for as a subject. Whereas in the subjective move is to say everything is just subjective, therefore I have control over it. So I shouldn't have to delay my gratifications. I shouldn't have to delay what I want. It should just be there for me. Well, the moment you take seriously like the delay of gratification that you're describing, that automatically makes the world more real. Like the world is instantaneously given a little more reality in that very delay. And Javier, good to see you again. And so in that very delay, I have to take the world more seriously. And right there's an opening now for the possibility of the quote unquote useless, the possibility of the emergent, the possibility of something I should honor as opposed to reduce to calculation. So I think it's very interesting to think of that delay as generative because it automatically says that the world is real. Now we have to go into how is it real and what way is it real? Is it a kind of a split thing, or is it an I-other absolute choice in Hegel? I mean, there are all those questions, but the very delay right there then suggests that I cannot make the world something I have complete power over. Therefore, what is this thing that I exist in relationship to, and how will I have it work on me, and how will I carry myself in it? So I think it's very astute on what you're pointing out on the delay, and Hannah Arendt is unbelievably brilliant. So I always appreciate you bringing her in.
Before we quickly move on, I'd like to make a point about what Chetan said about useless and useful. Now, if we live in a subjective or rather objective world, how do we determine what's useful? Because what's useful to me could be subjective to what's useful to you. And, we're constantly running in circles. And I think there was a very good analogy that Daniel made in our previous talk about how human beings are basically snakes trying to bite off their own tail. And I feel like this question is pretty much going to take us in circles, but, I would like to know your 2 cents on the matter. Let's see what the net can catch. Yes.
Well, Miss Sandy, and I'll pass it who wants to speak. I would say that what is useful is what gives us an opportunity to speak with you. And what takes away from that is what is useless. So that would be, I say.
Flattery is no substitute for intelligence, Daniel, but I'll take it.
Well, I'm glad you guys are still here after my class. I can still come back and say something. Sanduni, yeah, you raise a good point. It actually reminds me of what Michelle was telling me about when she was reading a little bit of Baudelaire or Baudrillard on his theory of contagion, right? So his theory of contagion is this: if everything is useful, then everything is useless. So if we make everything useful, it is virtually useless. And I actually really liked Michelle bringing this up to me. Yes, I've always tried to grapple with this question of utility. One of my favorite thinkers that I've come across, Sanduni, is I guess Susan Sontag is really growing on me, kind of out of by virtue. She used to be a Freudian, and then she wrote this big book on against interpretation. And if you think about utility is already predicated on some type of interpretation, which can hinder, ironically, the world useless because you are enforcing an interpretation by virtue of itself. And of course, we have to make an interpretation. So this is the inevitable position that we're in, right? Even Susan Sontag saying, okay, let's not interpret or be careful about this. That's an interpretation too. So we're in this really difficult position to say if this is useful or useless. I think there has to be another term to describe what is happening, because useless is like it's predicated on the conception of utility, right? What is the given utility of this thing? And so you're saying if we lack perception, then it is virtually useless. You know, if it's not acting the way it should act. What's funny about human beings is that we're the most useless things because we come up with the things that are useful. We don't even know where to place ourselves in the virtue of conversation of life, so we construct systems to make sense of life. And yet we are on the ground of the most useless beings because we we have to make sense of the world. So in fact, uselessness is the very ground for utility in the beginning. What is this use? What is, already we begin the question of what is this utility? But yeah, I feel like there needs to be another word, more like I like unfolding, revealing, because utility seems too stagnant to say something that is useful. Like it's such a time dependent concept. Like if you take art seriously, right? You say a cup can be an art, but you're saying that you're saying it's useless now because it's not utilizing its, essential feature of being poured into. So those are always fascinating points to think about. But yeah.
Very nice. I like your pink glow. It makes me think of a Japanese cherry blossom festival. That's really nice. And I don't think you're useless, Javier. No, wait, I do think you're useless because use is insulting. You're very useless, Javier. That's the best Valentine's card ever. I'm going to be like, you're useless. Oh, Chetan, please.
Just sort of quickly, it's a wonderfully difficult question that Sanduni asked. In that, I just thought, one of the difficult parts I think about this question is that if you think about Dall-E's relationship to reality, in that sense, in the Freudian universe, at least that reality itself is subjective. If you think about it, Freud's relationship to reality is not some objective reality. When he's discussing with the patient and so on and so forth, his idea is that a reality gets generated in the psyche no matter what the objective reality might be. So even if you have any kind of a, which is why even if you get a psychotic patient, it's not that he doesn't believe what he's seeing is to be real. For him, that is extremely real in that sense. So reality is not a direct outcome of our engagement with some objective world out there in that sense. It is in fact an outcome of our very extension of the drives. The delayed satisfaction itself creates a certain reality. That's the Freudian sort of insight there. So then the question, actually, the difficult question is, how does the objective reality get formed? It's not so much so that we have an objective reality, and then how does the subjective reality get formed? I think that question might be a little easier to sort of tackle. I think the difficult question is that if reality is very much a part of the way we cognize the world in that sense, then how do we reach to this objective world in that sense? How do we sort of structure this objective world for ourselves? And you can go back to Kant. Kant's sort of thinking on it was that any object has two forms of, two sides to its representation. One is the objective side, logical validity, he called it, and the other is the aesthetic side, aesthetic judgment. That's what. But I don't think they will never go back to Kant. I'm just saying that's the way the journey starts. And even there, it doesn't get fully resolved because Kant's idea of noumena phenomena, he says we can't know the world, and then he gets into transcendental, and that is where it sort of goes down. But the challenging aspect is that what structures a certain kind of reality which me and you can share together. I think there the insight which we can have is that the objective reality gets structured through our relationship to use in some senses. That is where usefulness comes into play in some senses. That when something becomes useful for even one individual, it is at that moment that, because desire is never desire for your own self. Desire is desire for the other. It is in that shared desire that objective world gets created. Am I right? Somewhere that my desire is never completely my own. My desire is my desire only because we can share a desire. It's in that sharing that some kind of objective world gets emerged in some senses. And I think one has to sort of think through, what does it mean to share a desire? What does it mean to create this common space? It is in that context that something like objectivity will become, accessible to us. I'm not sure how others would think about it, in that sense.
That was excellent, Chetan. Let me give it to Michelle. Now I have a completely new understanding. Y'all know that song, What the World Needs Now is Love? Now I understand it as ontological. They're like, I will note though, on the notion of love having like sharedness, it does make me think again, where like if you have a Trinity model where like there's something about like sharing that creates a shared reality, it is very interesting to think that. And I think Jonathan Rauch's book on determining the difference between belief and knowledge, or the highest likelihood of determining that difference being shared intelligibility, and his wonderful book in Kindly Inquisitors, and how that distinction between knowledge and belief is a really big deal for forming a socioeconomic system and what you're going to teach in school and what you're not going to teach. So that sharedness is also, I think, really, really important. Michelle, please.
So yeah, it makes me think of like Javier, in your work, where when you talk about passion having no object, right? There's a strange, interesting kind of, I don't know if this is just completely like me verbalizing it, so we'll see. But it's strange because it's like in this no object, this is where this like a shared objective space can be, I think, because like, for example, it makes me think of like, instead of thinking of it as useful or useless, right? I wonder if we could think about it as like reason or no reason. Like I think about a child asking me like, Mommy, why do you love me? And then, say, well, you the answer is because you're you, right? Like it's because I love you because you're you. It's not because, because if the child just got a list of all the things they did right, like, well, I love you because, you listen to me and, you put away your toys and da-da-da-da-da, then it would just become like, okay, so do you love me, or do you love like the things I do for you, or the things that you like about me? Not, you know what I mean? And so it's like, well, no, that's why the response of that sort of this all-consuming, all type of unconditional love is a I love you for you, right? So I think, like, to me, that's where the no reason comes in, and to me it's a bit more of a helpful barometer than the use and useless, because like Sandy was getting at, it's extremely, it kind of gets into this sort of a endless discussion on that, and like what's useful and what's useless, and what's useful to you is different, is not maybe not useful to me, right? But like this idea of like no reason is really powerful, and I think it's exactly that idea of like this you can't put it on anything in particular. It's just on it's something that is being done almost for no reason, and yet that's exactly what substantiates it so significantly. Like it's everything to have nothing. It's to have no reason, to have like nothing in the sense of no reason substantiates everything, right? And so I think in that way, I think about it like, well, if you just did it for certain reasons, like, and you can think about this in political and religious ideas too, when there's like this agenda, and this relates a lot to like the agenda concept, right? If it has an agenda, if the love has an agenda, if the politics have an agenda, if the religion has an agenda, then suddenly it was being done for this reason, and now it's like completely, it can become very destructive, right? It can become very empty. It can become very even suffocating. But where there's this no reason, somehow from that nothing, everything flows. And in that way, I think almost that there's a sharedness in no reason, right? Because like also anyways, our existence kind of comes into being almost for this same relation to passion and no object and no reason. But yeah, that's just like overflow of the passion itself that then is like a birth's existence. And then it kind of substantiates it in the no reason.
So Chetan brings up sharing. Obviously, this already implies some level of trust, and we've already talked about how trust already has like this ironic contradiction to it, where it's like people are trying to affirm trust to each other, and yet you have to believe what they're saying in order to even want to affirm trust with anybody. right? You can't be like, okay, you know, when you're already having doubts about the relationship, you already have to somewhat believe what the person is saying is true or adamant and real. But anyways, to get more to the point of sharing, Derrida actually has this wonderful exposition on YouTube where he talks about philosophy is between the who and the what. And I really like this exposition because oftentimes when we talk about sharing, we're concerned about what is being shared, not who is sharing. And so it's this very question of what that is troublesome for us. We like virtually miss the point when it comes to sharing because we're concerned about the what is being shared rather than who is sharing. And it's this ironic capacity, the fact that we can share is, in my opinion, the whole point. Not about what is being shared. It's the fact of who is sharing. It's kind of like when Kierkegaard goes to this exposition on the gift, and he's like, yeah, I've been talking really ambiguous about this gift because you don't really know what it is, you know, but you just know it's good. And I always appreciate him for saying that. But one of the problematic aspects with sharing is that we typically conflate reciprocity and mutuality. Reciprocity, the way I'm defining this, if you guys grant me this, reciprocity is almost like visual and physical evidence that somebody is exchanging something with you, right? I give you a hug, you give me a hug. This is reciprocal, right? But reciprocal does not imply mutuality because mutuality, as I define it, means that we have mutual intentions. We can both hug each other, but we may not have the same intentions about that hug, right? There may be alternatives to that hug, right? Girl may be like, oh, we're just friends, hug, right? The man be like, haha, I'm about to sneak in. I'm about to sneak in, right? So this thing about reciprocity and mutuality and the topic of sharing is very difficult because ultimately we are talking about the foundation of trust in this case, and it's very hard to determine somebody's intuitions. So, I mean, intuitions, somebody's intentions. And so we're left with this question of, you have either a couple of choices. You can either be completely paranoid about everybody, or you can choose to just literally have some type of faith beyond your knowing, because, I mean, at this point, you can question all you want, but fundamentally, you still have to either take their word as it is, you have to trust them, or you don't. And you're kind of left with very few options. So this idea between reciprocity and mutuality is very difficult to discern because oftentimes we conflate reciprocity as proof of this trust, right? If you exchange equally, then I trust you. However, that's not the case. We can exchange equally, but my intention could be completely alternative. You could be actually playing into my entire game, even though it seems completely reciprocal in nature. And so this is what makes it dangerous, and this is also what makes people pathologically paranoid, because if it happens to you once, then you don't want to do it again. So I don't have an answer, obviously, to this, but there is a kind of leap of faith that we are asking here when it comes to trust.
Lovely, and I'll pass it to Sandy, Chetan, and then Michelle. And I want you to know that when I hug you, there's going to be a whole lot of mutuality in that, because I think you're useless. No, Javier, it's beautiful. It's so sweet. I think you're useless. Sandy.
Thanks for the great points, Javier and Michelle. You guys always make great points. But I think what's really interesting about what Michelle said was replacing useful and useless with reason and no reason. Humans are innately selfish and full of desire. So reason equals desire. So there will always be a reason. And you compared it to the most existing reason, a child's love. You love the child because it's your flesh and blood. So there will always be reason. I think it's very difficult to sort of identify a synonym to go with it, because there is always some sort of reason, or even passion is some sort of desire where you will have a reason, and that's going to drive you to act a certain way. So I don't think that terminology works, Michelle. So that's one. The second point is, Javier, I like the point you made about sharing. I think it's very stimulating. We could, have a whole conversation about that. The whole concept of sharing, there is conscientious sharing versus e-sharing, as I would like to say. When you're on someone's social media, I treat people on social media, not treat them, or use the analogy furniture, because, it's like living in a home. All these people exist on social media like pieces of furniture in our house, but we don't use every single piece of furniture. Some are just there. They look good, but do they serve a purpose? Not quite. Would it make a difference if it wasn't there? We don't know, because, we haven't replaced it or changed it. And I think we really do live in a world, and I think we talked about this with dating and love and being reductionist and the unexamined life, with the whole difference between being conscientious in your choices. And I feel like in the modern day, let alone being subjective or objective, there is a lack of conscientious presence in the decisions you make or the life you choose to live, purely because you're so set in your ways to follow a certain trend, or you're told that, there are certain expectations of you that is out there in society or from your families, where if you did X, you've got to do Y, and if you did Y, you've got to do Z, or else you're useless. So I think those are a few thoughts, but yes, I would definitely like to know your thoughts on conscientious sharing versus e-sharing. I just came up with it. It's not really a thing, but that's one way to put the two, because I think it's, it exists in both extremes. The people who tend to be conscientious sometimes believe in living a life of solitude, because, you can't really find other people who choose to be conscientious or even seek it. And then with e-sharing, you overshare. That's also a big issue in society. If you don't overshare, you're not normal. And maybe you need to talk to a therapist because you don't know how to open up. Maybe I'm just conscientious about how I open up. Yeah, those are just a few thoughts.
Yes,
all right.
bullet that point. Yeah, no, we have this obsession now. If you don't share every moment of your life, you're a hateful, spiteful person. So I think that's a real problem. Let me get to Cheetah and Michelle. And also, I'm now wondering if my parents love me because they never said that I'm useless. I've never heard them call me useless, and now I'm wondering what that means. But Cheetah.
I think just to add a couple of points to what I think it's extremely interesting that Michelle got in the question of passion, because when we think about this question of sharing and desire, we forget that to what degree satisfaction is shared in a society, and it's almost strange. We might think it's something that should be very subjective. We all should have different satisfaction and so on and so forth. But our satisfactions are much more shared than they should be if they had if subjective and objective are completely two different things, isn't it? And if you look at, say, someone like Girard, this issue of mimetic nature of desire in that sense, that desire is always mimetic. If your desire gets copied by somebody else's desire, even in Freud, desire is desire for the other, because you always get into this problem that our desires are a lot more objective than they should be. There's some asymmetry there that we think, we imagine them to be completely subjective things, but they aren't actually, for whatever reasons in that sense. The other side of this debate is, then this discussion is question of language. If you think about it, a child learns language from very impoverished data. Am I right? People speaking around linguistics, say 2 years, 3 years old child listening to people speak, and actually emerging his own speech from that data. That data is extremely impoverished. He's not getting any computerized data in front of him where it's neatly written and so on and so forth, that what the rules of that language are. Yet he's picking up those rules. Not only is picking up those rules, he's picking up what you call grammatical judgment. He can judge whether the sentence is grammatical or not at very young ages. And not only he can judge, he can share the judgment with the community almost immediately. So again, that should, I think, tell us that this ability to form some kind of objective relationship with reality is not opposite to subjectivity. In fact, the road to that goes through a subjective relationship in some senses. it goes through our relationship to desire, goes through our relationship to language, and of course it goes through our relationship with through reason in that sense. Reason is another thing. At the end of it, we all can have our own reasons for doing what we do. There's nothing irrational in that sense. We all can create our own reasons to doing. But yet, for whatever reasons, our reasons also get shared immediately. So. It's not the case that if I reason something, you reason something, we can't sit and talk about it and bring out some kind of an. Something of an objective relationship to the world is already at stake in our own subjectivities. It's not something which comes after we have a subject, something which is other to a subjective world in that sense. I think that's where I was, trying to. Think that problem through, that something of that nature of the objective world is already at stake immediately in our subjective world itself, which is why when we feel something, we automatically expect the other person to feel the same way also. And once that feeling gets dissociated, once we are not able to share that feeling, normally the conversation breaks down. We get into escaping that form of linguistic exchange or language exchange or sharing of language, because there is immediately an expectation that if I am feeling this way, everybody else in my position can feel the same way also. Our feelings themselves already invoke this objective relationship to the world in that sense. We want that relationship to be true, which is why we form communities with people who think like us, feel like us, and so on and so forth. I think that's something which I think we need to, So in that sense, when we think about reciprocity and mutuality, even in the most reciprocal of relationships, something of a mutual comes up at stake in those contexts as well. And then when that expectation gets broken, we all get in some senses disillusioned to one degree or the other, almost in the sense that we were already expecting something mutual to be there, which wasn't so. It's not that we didn't have anything mutual and it's okay. It's never like that. We already had an expectation of that to be there, Yeah.
Beautifully put, and I'll pass it to Michelle and Sandy. And I fear I'll have to run in about 10 to 15 minutes, but this has been a joy. I've really enjoyed this very much. And it makes me wonder if there's it's almost like instead of subject to object, it's like mine, shared, ours. Like mine as in it's mine, which is and then it's like shared, but then ours where you identify with the determination, like in Hegel, where you make it a necessity and this sort of move. So there's something very interesting there, but let me give it to Michelle.
So that's a fair point, Sandy. That's a very fair point in saying that perhaps that language won't hold water. But I think what I mean by the no reason is to almost have not a possessive nature toward those relations or even those reasons, because, like this idea of disillusionment that Jitan's talking about, it's very inevitable, right? It's very inevitable that whatever, even if we have reasons for something, that they don't necessarily transpire the way we maybe anticipated. And so I guess for me, it sort of, I think the language works in my head simply because it doesn't actually mean that there's literally no reasons for, whatever it is, when you're saying with loving children, it's your own flesh, of course, you love them because the reason is they're your own flesh, right? And you love them for who they are. Okay. But the thing is that it's the attitude toward those reasons, I think, the possessive nature toward the relation itself, or the possessive nature toward what should be the shared subjectivity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's where the problem comes into place. That's where this sort of, I'm talking about reason in this autonomous rationality, in the sort of sense that people should have the same thinking as why I did X, Y, or Z. And it's just that's not assured for you ever. And so this idea of the no reason is this place of being able to do it in a sense, in and of itself, in that kind of Hegelian sense, right? Where there's this in and for itself. And can you live with that? Can you live with the fact that you can birth a child who then says, why did you birth me? Can you do that? Can you live with that? And I think, to me, that's the place of the no reason. And I think that's why love is often unreasonable, because it's something that is out of it puts you in such I mean, we can say unreasonable, we could say non-rational, right? But that's really the place of the no reason that I'm sort of speaking to. So I hope that addresses what you're bringing up, Sandy.
That was great. And what the point you made was great, Chetan. I really enjoyed it. You always make very stimulating points. You know, when you talk about language, you know, human beings are innately very critical about themselves. And I think there's another very interesting chapter in Thoughts that, you know, says critical people aren't critical thinkers. I'm just connecting the dots here on the net. And I think it's really important to know the difference between those two things and to be able to realize whether, you know, I feel like personally, I would think that we live in a society where people are critical purely to find fault and aren't critical thinkers, because that actually requires assessment and time and being conscientious, and those are some major lacks in the current society we live in. However, on the matter of subjectivity versus objectivity and the whole discussion about passion and what's useful and useless, do you think it weighs upon one side than the other, whichever side you may think it is because people are critical of themselves or are critical thinkers? I'll leave you with a question. That is all from me.
If I could try to explain a little bit what Michelle was saying, because I think she got the main point. But the thing about giving reasons is that implicitly, once you give a reason, you also give a not reason. So if you say, you're my son, I love you, because you're my son. So that means if I wasn't your son, you wouldn't love me. And immediately then it goes into question, well, what is your definition of son? Does it mean me doing what you want me to do that you define me as son? And so immediately you can see how shaky that reasoning is the moment you say, I love you because you're my son. And so you can already hear the implicit non-reason. And that's kind of scary because, like Michelle was saying, it's the forsake of itself. And that's the more problematic. And that's why I talk about passion a lot, because passion, I like to think of passion as a man that's possessed. He doesn't concern himself with the reasons. He actually kind of knows if he gives a reason, it doesn't capture what he's talking about. That's the difference. A man that is desirous, he knows exactly what he wants and why. He has no question about this. He knows exactly why he wants it. A man that's passionate about something, he's like, you could ask him, give me a reason why you do this. And he could be like, I do this because of this, but you know, that you're still not getting the point. You know, it's like he understands why it's so difficult to express why he likes art or why he likes philosophy, you know. So when it comes to critically thinking, I would say a man that is passionate about critical thinking understands that already enough. There isn't not a criteria for critical thinking. There's always something elusive about it. Like it's just he's passionate about wanting to think about it, rather than people who critically think have a kind of agenda for their thinking as thinking. But a man who passionately critically thinks has a kind of engendering quality about himself. He wants to contribute in some type of way, not diminish and destroy. But of course, engendering involves some type of destroying, but it's in the pursuit of clarifying.
Maybe try and think through this question of objectivity and critique in some sense. It's extremely interesting that if you think about critique and being critical of someone, what's the distinction? So critique always involves, to one degree or another, thinking with someone, whereas being critical of someone involves thinking against someone, in that sense, against something, isn't it? That in that sense, critique, at least historically, one can think of critique as a form of thinking or an act of thinking where you do not have any ground, any presuppositions, any rules that can guide that thinking immediately. Am I right? That's the problem, say, that Nietzsche sort of gave us, that evaluation eventually is a form of re-evaluation at all points of time. It's a question of trying to think without any presupposed ground upon which that thinking is possible, and yet not completely letting go of all the rules and so on and so forth. But there cannot be any predetermined rules that can completely guide that process. Eventually, you are on your own. You have to learn to swim in that. You may find rules to give you direction, but there cannot be any predetermined rules that can completely guide that process for you. That's the ground of critique. Since Kant to Nietzsche to, one can see that journey going on conclusively. if that is the ground of critique in that sense, where you are essentially groundless, where ground emerges from that groundlessness, then there's something very interesting about our objective relationship to the world, which is that our objective relationship to the world doesn't emerge from singular interpretations. So our objective relationship to the world doesn't emerge if me and you have the same interpretation. In fact, our objective relationship to the world emerges in plurality, which is extremely, it's extremely counterintuitive. The more different interpretations we have of an object, the more our objective relationship gets threatened. The more we and you can share something, which is why when me and you are saying the same thing, it gets boring. It's not objective. It's simply a collapse of thinking in that sense. Our objective relationship to the world emerges when we can have a plurality and yet have points of a grammar emerging in some sense, the points of agreement upon that object in that plurality itself. So objectivity in that sense is not against plurality. Normally we think plurality is simply subjective. That's not true. In fact, there is a form of plurality which is extremely objective, which is what happens when we are discussing, say, things like in this forum. We enjoy coming here because we are finding an objective relationship to the world within our plural ideas. I think that's something which we need to be very conscious of, that normally we sort of simply very easily oppose objectivity to plurality. That opposition normally, if we are a little subtle about or sensitive about the places where that opposition breaks down, we realize that something like objectivity comes at stake in plurality itself, not in singularity. In singularity, there is nothing of objectivity anyway of importance. There is no importance of objectivity there. Objectivity is either automatically there or it's not there. Something like objectivity is only at stake when the world is essentially plural. And then we can have.
That was magnificent. I really like this point that plurality actually means there's like a world there. I think what ends up happening when we ask the question of subjectivity and objectivity, we're asking individual, me, and the world. But if I ask us and the world, oh, well, we must be sharing something. And so it's very interesting to think that multiple interpretations, the very existence of multiple interpretations would then suggest objectivity, that there's a world there, right? And yet we tend to think of plurality as moving us away from objectivity, but it actually would move us closer, because the very existence of shared interpretations means there's something to share interpretations about, the plausibility of which is increased by plurality, not decreased by plurality. That is a magnificent point. I really like that. To Sanduni's comment, I was going to note that if I was merely a subject to a subject, I wouldn't be critical because I'm all that is, and it's perfect, right? And if I was an object to an object, I also wouldn't be critical because I would be a rock. So the criticalness emerges in the divide, and I am comparing myself with the objective. And the other conflation we tend to do is conflate objective with perfect, which is a mistake, but that tends to occur. And so the very existence of the object, of which by definition I experience myself as not being, therefore means I am not perfect, which then means I should be critical. Oh, but you're not either, so I'm going to project that on you and be critical of you rather than myself. You see? So that's what ends up happening. There's a, oh crap, I'm not objective, therefore I'm not perfect. Oh crap, but that means they're not either. So you then project it on others and become critical instead of critical on yourself. I think that's a movement. But then to Chetan's point, which was really magnificent, there is something, Michelle, as well, where it seems as if you start with the no reason of chaos, then you go into reason, but then we have to come back to a kind of reason free, right? So like chaos, like there's no reason for anything, and that's kind of demonic, right? It's kind of chaotic, and that's bad. But then you go into reason. But if you stay in reason and say, oh, I love my kid because they're good at math, that's demonic too. So you almost have to go through reason into a reason-free state, right? Now that's going to, of course, be a Hegelian a Humean philosophical journey. That would also be Hegelian. That there's this three-step movement where if you just stay in no reason, that's chaos. But then if you go to reason and stay in reason, that's reductionist. And so you have to move into a kind of reason-free or non-reason or some term, which is a certain, it's almost like the structure of a flower. I guess, like a structure of a plant. There is a structure in a garden, and yet the structure is inseparable from the garden. Like the garden has to grow for there to be the structure, right? And so you can't separate it. And that's when we start talking something emergent. Something emergent is something that structure is inseparable from the phenomenon. Something that seems to have a reason is when you can separate the thing from the structure, right? So you almost have no structure. Then you have a state where you can separate the thing from the structure. And then you have a state where structure and thing are together, I guess. And so there's some sort of movement that has to happen. And if you don't, with your children, move to a place where the reason is the child and the structure is what the child emerges and becomes, then you have trouble. And so that seems to be part of what is at play. And it makes me think also, almost if we're going back to this question of uselessness, and then I fear I will have to run, this has been a complete delight. What's the difference between the uselessness of a black hole and the uselessness of a white hole? You cannot use either of them because both will kill you. But the uselessness of a black hole is in its uselessness, it eats and destroys everything, right? So it's useless because it destroys everything. But a white hole is useless because it's infinite creation. It's pushing out the universe, right? A black hole sucks in, a white hole pushes out. And you cannot use a white hole because the creative possibility of it is so great that it blows you away. And then if you used it, you'd actually get in the way of that creativity, right? So it seems to be that in the name of the game of society, wanting to make sure that we didn't accidentally create a useless black hole, we went too far as a culture and removed the possibility of a useless white hole. And as a result, we've all become reductionists. And it would seem like what you do with a white hole is honor it, not use it, you honor it. You honor that there is something of which is creating more than you can ever fully capture, because if you do not, you will cut off that creative possibility. If you do not look at a garden as something that you cannot mechanically engineer into growth, then you will kill it. And so it becomes incredible. It's as if society started off in a historic age where we were just chaos. We didn't know what we were doing. Then we built the tractor. So we created a reason which made us make till the garden. And now we're at the phase where we have to not think the tractor grows the garden. And we keep doing the till over and over again. Well, that's not going to happen. You got to stop tilling and now let the garden grow, right? So you have a movement from chaos to the reason free, right? And today what we're seeing is the necessity of the historic moment to honor the useless in the sense of the useless as white hole. And if we do not do that, we will continue to have these mental health crises, these meaning crises, these different reductionisms that seem to be so problematic. And I think it is also interesting that the structure and the emergent possibilities of this very white hole do seem to be replicated when one, say, comes into a discussion like the net, where you don't know what you're going to say and you don't know what's going to happen, and you can't even say why the net has use, right? Like, what is the use of the net? What is the use of these conversations? It is not there. And yet the very willingness to engage in a certain relation where the use of the relation is not known except in it, when you cannot know what is going to happen unless you do it. And it would seem that the reason free we are describing is a reason that cannot be known outside of participation. It is in participation that the reason is very concrete. It is very much there, but it cannot be known as concrete unless you are in it. So if you are not in it, you cannot know it. But if you are in it, it is undeniable. And it would seem as if these spaces are unveiling precisely the capacity of the human being to relate in such a manner that they collectively can give rise to something like a white hole that simulates what we as a socioeconomic system need to implement on the macro. And the question is simply, how does one go about that? What is the socioeconomic structures, et cetera, so forth. But what you see in the ability of human beings who have conditioned themselves not to look for use, to not be reductionists, who are willing to go into a space that are open to the other in a kind of trusting manner, to then function in this sort of white hole that is able to create and to give rise. And the difference here seems to be akin to the difference between lumber and wine in Heidegger. In Heidegger, lumber is standing reserve. That's the black hole. That's where what is trees exist to, you reduce them to lumber, right? And yet for Heidegger, grapes is not standing reserve. The fullness of the grape is actually brought out in the wine. We know grapes in their fullness as wine. But wait, isn't that reducing it? Isn't that turning it into a good? No, because actually the grape as wine honors it. That is something that then speaks to the fullness of it. And I think the challenge today is being able to discern the difference between reducing forests to lumbers and honoring grapes and wine, which is not easy to do. And that's the kind of difference in relationships we have to find as well. What is the difference between a relationship that is using it for something and a relationship of which is honoring it? And in that very honoring, we might find the capacity to generate and give rise to that white hole in which who knows what kind of worlds may come out of it. But I've enjoyed this. Thank you very much. This has been a complete delight. Javier, good job on all your subsects. Hi, Ruth.